warm welcome to and good morning to all of you. It is my pleasure to open today's ISIS Public Forum on Women in Politics, Experiences and Lessons. ISIS Thailand has held many public forums, but today is the first of its kind. We have had forums and seminars on comparative politics and international relations, on politics of Thailand and Southeast Asia, on the South China Sea and the Mekong region, on the Indo-Pacific and the Asia-Pacific, event on the Middle East and Middle East wars, Brexit and Trump. We have had a few panels that comprise of women speakers, including one on Thailand's economic upgrading. But today, it is my pleasure to introduce to you our first panels on politics with all women speakers. We are led by former New Zealand Prime Minister Helen Clark, who also served subsequently as an administrator of UNDP. We are also joined by 4 leading women who have been involved in Thai politics in different capacities. Let me thank each of them on behalf. Dr. Nalini Thavisin, leader of Pheu Tham Party, Ms. Kopkan Wattana Walangkun, former Minister of Tourism and Sport, and also chairperson of Toshiba Thailand Company Limited. Ms. Chompunut Nakhonthap, Member of Parliament candidate, Democrat Party, and Ms. Panika Wanit, spokesperson of the Future Forward Party. Thailand is on course to hold its first election in less than 3 months after the last poll more than 7 years ago. So this public forum is timely to tease out experiences and lessons that we can learn from. I have to say thank you to the ambassador of New Zealand and also the Frederick Naumann Stiftung in supporting our faculty to arrange this event. And let me now hand the floor back to Ajahn Thitinan to introduce former Prime Minister Helen Clark. Thank you.
Well, let me just introduce the Right Honourable Helen Clark in two ways. First, about a decade ago, when I first met her, as academics go to conferences and workshops and all kinds of meetings and forums, right? So normally academics get tired; they flag in the afternoons. 10 years ago, Helen Clark chaired an academic conference. It was an interfaith dialogue. She chaired the whole day, and all these other scholars and academics by the afternoon, mid-afternoon, they were half asleep. But she carried the same momentum, the same fortitude. That's what I remembered the entire day. Like the last minute was like the first minute. That's one thing I want to just say by way of introduction. Very unwavering kind of intellectual fortitude. And of course, you know that she's been the Prime Minister of New Zealand. New Zealand is a country that I think has a right fit for us today. I mean, New Zealand was a country first to give women the right to vote 100 years ago. In fact, there was a recent celebration of the centennial. Also, New Zealand was the first country to allow women to participate in elections. I think that was 1893. So New Zealand has the right image, right fit, and pioneer in many ways. Helen Clark was Prime Minister for a number of years, I think. And then after that, after the domestic public service, she went on to international public service as the administrator of the United Nations Development Program based in New York. So, you come with very distinguished career, both at home and abroad. And I think we were deprived when there was a vacancy at the UN Secretary General. But nevertheless, you return home and now doing a bit of a tour. Helen Clark is in Thailand to open a film called kind of a documentary, My Year with Helen. It was shown in the opening ceremony last night, and more showing tonight, I think, another show. There's also a website where you can access the film, and I'll give you some details later. But for now, let me just invite you by yourself, Ms. Clark, to the stage for some remarks, drawing on your experiences and maybe perhaps teasing out some lessons for the role of women in politics based on your background. Please.
Thank you for the kind introduction. Can I acknowledge the members of the diplomatic corps here and the university leadership, and of course my fellow panellists who are going to be with me talking about, well, sharing experiences and lessons. And don't let me start on my war stories of many, many years in politics, because this could turn into a day-long seminar. But certainly I think we have some experiences to share from New Zealand. And the starting point for my comments will be that women have to be at the decision-making table. If you're not at the table, out of sight, out of mind. There are so many issues that do not get effectively addressed, which impact on women's lives, because the women aren't there to raise them loudly. And around the world, we've seen that when women come into decision-making in a critical mass, things that were never addressed before begin to get addressed. Even key women in key places can address things that were never attended to before. So it is the right thing to do for women to be in politics and in decision making, but actually for countries it's also the smart thing to do. And if we put this in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals and the 2030 Agenda, what is its central principle? Leave no one behind. If you leave women behind in development, you're never going to achieve those goals. Countries will never achieve their potential. It's not just that women won't be able to achieve their full potential, the whole country won't. So it is good for everyone when women are in decision-making, and that applies not only in the political decision-making, it applies in public administration, which has been a much understudied area for women's participation. When I was at UNDP, they started quite a large project on women in public administration. And actually at the top levels globally, it's not much better than in the private sector. And let me say a word on the private sector for a moment, because despite all the evidence that companies with the significant numbers of women on their boards and in their senior management do better than those who don't, still the numbers are quite low. Fortune 500 companies, on average about 20% women on the boards. So smell the coffee is my advice to the private sector, that if you have a board and senior management which is well representative of women, those women are going to be more attuned to what women consumers want, because women have buying power. They buy goods and services, and I suspect that exactly the reason why the companies which do have significant numbers of women on boards and in senior management do better is because they are attuned to what the woman consumer wants. But let me come back to draw a little bit on the New Zealand experience, because this year is the 125th year of women having the right to vote. In fact, just in the last day or so, it's been the 125th anniversary of women casting their first vote. This was the first country in the world where women won the right to vote in nationwide elections. And I say won, it wasn't given on a plate. The women took a petition, the length and breadth of New Zealand, campaigning for the right to vote. And what I think is truly remarkable is that in 1893, in a little legislature in one of the most geographically remote parts of the world, an all-male parliament agreed to the petition. This is really quite staggering. And by the way, the franchise was for everyone. Indigenous women were included in that. Indigenous women fought for the franchise along with the women descended from the European settlers like myself. So it was always equality in that respect. Now, in my 8 years with UNDP, travelling to, well, amazing places and meeting amazing people, I would always meet with women. And often women who are very interested in the political system. And they would say, oh, it's taking so long here to get significant numbers of women. And I would say to them, well, don't take as long as we did, right? Because it's all very well to be the first where you win the right to vote. But we didn't get the right to stand for Parliament until 1919, so that's quite a while after the right to vote. The first woman wasn't elected to the New Zealand Parliament till 1933. That was 40 years after the right to vote was won. And she was the widow of the gentleman who had just died in the constituency. And often in the early stages of women's representation, you see this pattern that the woman who comes in is the daughter of the man who just died, or the widow of the guy who's just died. So that was that pattern. We had our first woman cabinet minister in 1947. She was elected in 1943, so rose quite quickly. She was the daughter of a member of Parliament who had passed away. She was quite a character. But by the time I was elected to the New Zealand Parliament in 1981, there had never been more than 4 women in the Parliament at one time, and that was the high water mark reached in 1978. Usually it was 1 or 2 or maybe 3 in the 70s and well, in the 60s, nothing much. So I was part of a kind of generation of children born after World War II whose parents had high aspirations and expectations, and we were on the move, and part of that movement for women's equality. But it actually wasn't easy going into the New Zealand Parliament in 1981 when the numbers doubled from 4 to 8. And the newspapers wrote, what's going on in New Zealand politics? The women are taking over. We were 9%, right? 9%, but we were taking over. Well, eventually we did, by the way, but not in 1981. But it was quite a difficult environment. And I tell these stories because Thailand has not had many women elected to Parliament. And when you go in as some of those early movers, you will find that the Parliament is often a bit like a gentleman's club. They're not used to having ladies around. You had to look very, very hard for the bathroom, for example, in the New Zealand Parliament. And I used to joke about there being 3 forms of recreation for members of Parliament. One of them exercised this muscle, which was at the bar. Another one exercised this muscle in the snooker room, right? And a third one exercised these muscles playing poker at night. Now here was I and other young women of my generation coming from the university. None of this appealed to us. I could never hold a billiards cue, by the way. It didn't work. So we had to be part of changing the whole culture of our Parliament. And I think eventually with some success it became a much more women-friendly space. But these aren't women-friendly spaces when women are first breaking into them in significant numbers. Now, when I look at this anniversary year we've been having in New Zealand on the 125th anniversary, I say to myself, why has this had a lot more traction than, say, the centennial of women's suffrage, which was 25 years ago? Because I can't remember so much going on. And I think it's for a couple of reasons. Firstly, New Zealand now has its 3rd woman Prime Minister, right? For more than half the last 21 years, New Zealand has had women Prime Ministers. There's something in the water in New Zealand, right? And let me say, all of the women Prime Ministers come from girl-only families and are the oldest in those families, and all come from rural or small-town New Zealand. So I think we're particularly resilient individuals who are lucky to grow up in very supportive families. But we now have a new young woman Prime Minister elected at 37, and she's been a bit of a global sensation. She's had a baby in office, and people have been very interested in that. The baby even went to the General Assembly and had a little card made for its identity card, so youngest person, I think, ever to enter a formal meeting of the General Assembly. But this has caused a lot of discussion, that it is possible for a young woman to come through and lead the country, and very exciting for young women. I think another reason why the 125th anniversary has had a lot of traction is because we are in another phase in New Zealand of the gender equality struggle. And I think it's because of the focus that the Me Too movement brings, #MeToo, and the fact that we are very unhappy with the level of domestic and family violence in our country. And if you're looking at what are remaining barriers to women's equality, domestic and family violence, sexual and gender-based violence is a very, very significant barrier to women achieving their potential, and we have to tackle that head on. So I am one who is very positive about the Me Too movement, because I think it is flushing out issues that have been hidden for too long and not talked about for forever. And you only start to change things when you put the sort of the glare of publicity on a problem. So, just coming a little bit to the global scene, women are still few and far between at the highest levels. I used figures in March for a lecture at the Asian Development Bank on this subject, that under 8% of heads of state are women, and that includes queens, and I can think of at least 3 queens off the top of my head, the Netherlands, Denmark, and of course the Queen who's in London, who's also the Queen of New Zealand and Canada and Australia, and so on. Under 6% of the world's prime ministers are female. Only, on average, 23.3% of parliamentarians worldwide are female. So these are really quite low numbers. Now, when I was at UNDP, we used to work a lot on women's political participation, and still do, and so does UN Women, obviously. And 6.5 years ago at the Commission on the Status of Women, I launched for UNDP a publication which was a guidebook to increasing women's participation in parliaments. And it was based on case studies of what actually has worked around the world. And UNDP used to advocate, and I advocate, that if nothing else works fast, countries should look at temporary special measures like quotas, because a quota will get a lot of women elected fast. If you're not satisfied at the progress, I think it's well worth considering. I mean, legislatures can go round this in circles for years. When I went to Papua New Guinea as administrator for the first time, I had been before as Prime Minister, but as administrator, we were assisting then the only woman parliamentarian, who was also the only woman cabinet minister, with a draft piece of legislation for reserved seats in Parliament for women. I mean, Dame Carol Kidu, the only woman member of Parliament, was a bit lonely. She said, I've got to have more women in this Parliament. And so what was designed in full consultation with the leading women in Papua New Guinea was to have a system where there would be, I think, 22 reserved seats for women. And in the Papua New Guinea Parliament, they have 22 seats in the Parliament which are occupied by the governors of their provinces. So the simplest answer was just to say that each of those provinces will have a woman-only election for a woman member from that province, which clearly would have worked. They're still debating it, right? Several elections later, and last election, Papua New Guinea, no women were elected at all. Last election in Vanuatu in the South Pacific, no women were elected at all. In the Solomon Islands last time, 1 woman was elected out of the 50 members of Parliament. Now, UNDP invited me to go up to the Solomon Islands in August to be at a big workshop which was very kindly sponsored by the European Union and the Australian High Commission. to encourage women from all parties to come across and run for Parliament. And there were wonderful women there, and a lot of women will run, but will they make it through? This is the issue. Now, in the guidebook that UNDP issued, it said you have to take a whole electoral cycle approach to this. So the first phase is the selection phase. And here's where the role of the political parties is so important, because political parties can be the greatest champions of women's participation or the worst opponents of it. So you have to convert them to being the greatest champions. And don't let the political parties say, oh, we can't find the women. If they say they can't find them, they're not looking hard enough, because the women are there. You know, I see this everywhere I go. The women are there and they're interested. But, you know, they're also looking often at the way politics is conducted and thinking, do I really want to be part of that? Well, there has to be change. The door has to be open. Women need to mobilise too and get their alliances so that they can, you know, sort of push their way into what might not have been a very welcoming environment. So the selection phase is important. And then there's the election phase. And the truth is that in general, the old girls' networks do not have as much money as the old boys' networks. So money is an issue for women candidates worldwide. And political parties need to be thinking about that and how they're going to, you know, support the women candidates to be properly funded. Because one assumes if parties have selected women, they'd like them to be elected. So do something positive about the funding. It's also true that in a number of countries, women running for politics will face particular physical security difficulties, which could be life-threatening. And we need go no further than instance the tragic death of Benazir Bhutto on the campaign trail, right? Now, I'm not saying it's only because of gender, but there was a very prominent woman politician killed on the campaign trail. So women do need security. The third part of our advice was that when women are elected, and particularly when they're coming in where women haven't really been before, it's very important to form women's groupings in the Parliament. And, I mean, parties will have their groupings, but there are also things that women across parties should be working on. The women should get together across political parties and see whether they, you know, as a group can identify what is it that the women constituents are saying and, you know, how could they work together to advance that, but also to give themselves peer support. I think that's very important. And the you know, the more experienced ones also nurturing the younger ones as well. I want to make another point about electoral systems, which is relevant to political representation. The systems which are the toughest in the world for women to get elected from are the first past the post systems, the Westminster-style system, where you have individual constituencies and the person with the most votes wins, right? Now, traditionally, the stereotype of a member of Parliament from such a constituency is of a man with a wife and children. Those are the photos, right? So women are sort of trying to break in where there's a stereotype that's not about them. Now, in New Zealand, we changed our political system, our electoral system, in 1996. In 1993 election, under the old system, as I've just described it, we actually got up to 20% women elected. In one election under the new system, it leapt to 30%. And that was because the new system of proportional representation brought party lists. And if political parties are seriously going to go out and ask for women's votes and present a party list without women on it, well, why would women vote for it, really? So actually, over time, the parties have taken this on and said, yeah, this is important. And we're now seeing the representation of women right across the political parties. It used to be something that the Labor Party did much better on, but everyone now has women members, and often very significant numbers of women members. So the political system had a big role to play in that, the change in the electoral system, and we're now over 38% women members of Parliament in New Zealand. And I think if the political parties tried really hard, you could get to gender parity in the next 2 to 3 elections. That is possible, because once you're close to 40%, it's 1 or 2 more heaves, and you're virtually there. Look, I'm seeing really some very positive, movements among women on political representation. As I said, the Solomon's women are mobilising. I was just in Bahrain a couple of weeks ago. They've got an election kind of any time now. Maybe they've even had it. But, there were a lot of women standing in Bahrain. Fantastic. They brought together a global conference. The Speaker of the Legislative Assembly in United Arab Emirates came, a woman speaker, very prominent women from other bodies, legislatures in the region. And I'm not sure how much focus there's been on some of these very interesting developments with the appointments of cabinets in a number of countries. But in Ethiopia, the new Prime Minister, who's clearly very reform-minded on a number of things, has appointed a cabinet that's 50% female. And then, not to be outdone, Rwanda appointed one that was 50% female as well within the next week or two. Ethiopia has just, in effect, appointed its first woman president. I mean, this is phenomenal. And it doesn't matter to me that the presidency may not be, a very powerful position. It's symbolic, because you can't be what you can't see, right? And now a young woman in Ethiopia goes, oh, a woman's the president of my country. Half the cabinet ministers. I mean, this is important. In Kenya, they're still debating the quota, and I think, just scanning the headlines, they have a constitution which has a target for women's representation in Parliament, but it hasn't been achieved, and the highest court has told the Parliament to go back and do this properly and make sure that what the legislation, what the constitution says should happen does happen. So, really quite interesting developments out there. So just to conclude, I know elections are coming up in Thailand next year, and I really hope that the political parties are going to go out and recruit women candidates, because women in Thailand have a lot of things, I'm sure, that they would like their governments and parliaments to address. But if the women's voices aren't loud in those parliaments, well, things just don't get the attention that they should. So, I really hope that we will see a blossoming of women's representation in these elections. And I know we have 3 very articulate people here with some experience in these matters, and really encourage you and the parties and tendencies that you represent to reach out and recruit more women and hopefully back their success. Thank you very much.